Good wishes to all of you. Textbook in History for Class 12. Themes in Indian History Part 2. Theme 9. Kings and Chronicles. The Mughal Courts 16th-17th centuries. Take a look at figure 9.1. The mausoleum of Taimur at Samarkand 1404. The rulers of the Mughal Empire saw themselves as appointed by divine will to rule over a large and heterogeneous populace. Although this grand vision was often circumscribed by actual political circumstances, it remained important. One way of transmitting this vision was through the writing of dynastic histories. The Mughal kings commissioned court historians to write accounts. These accounts recorded the events of the emperor's time. In addition, their writers collected vast amounts of information from the regions of the subcontinent to help the rulers govern their domain. Modern historians writing in English have termed this genre of text chronicles as they present a continuous chronological record of events. Chronicles are an indispensable source for any scholar wishing to write a history of the Mughals. At one level, they were a repository of factual information about the institutions of the Mughal state, painstakingly collected and classified by individuals closely connected with the court. At the same time, these texts were intended as conveyors of meanings that the Mughal rulers sought to impose on their domain. They therefore give us a glimpse into how imperial ideologies were created and disseminated. This chapter will look at the workings of this rich and fascinating dimension of the Mughal Empire. Take a look at figure 9.2, an 18th century depiction of Humayun's wife Nadira crossing the desert of Rajasthan. The Mughals and their empire. The name Mughal derives from Mongol. Though today the term evokes the grandeur of an empire, it was not their name the rulers of the dynasty chose for themselves. They referred to themselves as Timurids, as descendants of the Turkish ruler Timur on the paternal side. Babur, the first Mughal ruler, was related to Genghis Khan from his mother's side. He spoke Turkish and referred derisively to the Mongols as barbaric hordes. During the 16th century, Europeans used the term Mughal to describe the Indian rulers of this branch of the family. Over the past centuries, the word had been frequently used. Even the name Mowgli, the young hero of Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, is derived from it. The empire was carved out of a number of regional states of India through conquests and political alliances between the Mughals and local chieftains. The founder of the empire, Jahiruddin Babur, was driven from the Central Asian homeland, Farghana, by the warring Uzbeks. He first established himself at Kabul and then in 1526 pushed further into the Indian subcontinent in search of territories and resources to satisfy the needs of the members of his clan. His successor Nasiruddin Humayun 1530-40, 1555-56 expanded the frontiers of the empire but lost it to the Afghan leader Sher Shah Sur, who drove him into exile. Humayun took refuge in the court of the Safavid ruler of Iran. In 1555, Humayun defeated the Surs but died in a year later. Many considered Jalaluddin Akbar 1556-1605 the greatest of all the Mughal empires, for he not only expanded but also consolidated his empire, making it the largest, strongest and richest kingdom of his time. Akbar succeeded in extending the frontiers of the empire to the Hindukush mountains and checked the expansionist designs of the Uzbeks of Turan, Central Asia and the Safavids of Iran. Akbar had three very able successors in Jahangir 1605-27, Shah Jahan 1628-58 and Aurangzeb 1658-1707. Much as their characters varied, under them the Territorial expansion continued, though at a much reduced pace. The three rulers maintained and consolidated the various instruments of governance. Discuss. Find out whether the state in which you live formed part of the Mughal Empire. Were there any changes in the area as a result of the establishment of the empire? If your state was not part of the empire, find out more about contemporary regional rulers, their origins and policies, what kind of records did they maintain. Chagatai Turks trace a descent from the eldest son of Genghis Khan. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the institutions of an imperial structure were created. These included effective methods of administration and taxation. The visible center of Mughal power was the court. Here, political alliances and relationships were forged, status and hierarchies defined. The political system devised by the Mughals was based on a combination of military power and conscious policy to accommodate the different traditions they encounter in the subcontinent. After 1707, following the death of Aurangzeb, the power of the dynasty diminished in place of the vast apparatus of empire controlled from Delhi, Agra or Lahore. The different capital cities, regional powers acquired greater autonomy. Yet, symbolically, the prestige of the Mughal ruler did not lose its aura. In 1857, the last scion of this dynasty, Bahadur Shah Jafar II, was overthrown by the British. The production of chronicles. Chronicles commissioned by the Mughal emperors are an important source for studying the empire and its court. They were written in order to project a vision of an enlightened kingdom to all those who came under its umbrella. At the same time, they were meant to convey to those who resisted the rule of the Mughals that all resistance was destined to fail. Also, the rulers wanted to ensure that there was an account of their rule for posterity. The authors of Mughal chronicles were invariably courtiers. The histories they wrote focused on events centered on the central ruler, his family, the court and nobles, wars and administrative arrangements. Their titles such as the Akbar Nama, Shah Jahan Nama, Alamgir Nama, that is the story of Akbar, Shah Jahan and Alamgir, a title of the Mughal ruler Aurangzeb, suggest that in the eyes of their authors the history of the empire and the court was synonymous with that of the emperor. From Turkish to Persian, Mughal court chronicles were written in Persian under the sultans of Delhi. It flourished as the language of the court and of literary writings alongside North Indian languages, especially Hindavi and its regional variants, as the Mughals were Chagatai Turks by origin. Turkish was their mother tongue. Their first ruler Babur wrote poetry and his memoirs in this language. It was Akbar who consequently set out to make Persian the leading language of the Mughal court. Cultural and intellectual contacts with Iran, as well as a regular stream of Iranian and Central Asian migrants seeking positions at the Mughal court, might have motivated the emperor to adopt the language. Persian was elevated to a language of empire, conferring power and prestige on those who had him command of it. It was spoken by the king, the royal household and the elite at court. Further, it became the language of administration at all levels, so that accounts, clerks and other functionaries also learnt it. Even when Persian was not directly used, its vocabulary and idiom heavily influenced the language of official records in Rajasthan and Marathi and even Tamil. Since the people using Persian in the 16th and 17th centuries came from many different regions of the subcontinent and spoke other Indian languages, Persian too became Indianized by absorbing local idioms. A new language, Urdu, sprang from the interaction of Persian with the Hindi. Mughal chronicles such as the Akbarnama were written in Persian. Others like Babur's memoirs were translated from the Turkish into the Persian Baburnama. Translation of Sanskrit texts such as the Mahabharata and the Ramayana into Persian were commissioned by the Mughal emperors. The Mahabharata was translated as the Razam Nama, Book of Wars. The fight of the written word. Written word. In Abul Fazl's words, the written word may embody the wisdom of bygone ages and may become a means to intellectual progress. The spoken word goes to the heart of those who are present to hear it. The written word gives wisdom to those who are near and far. If it was not for the written word, the spoken word would soon die, and no keepsake would be left us from those who are passed away. Superficial observers see in the letter a dark figure, but the deep sighted see in it a lamp of wisdom. Chirag I Shinasai. The written word looks black, notwithstanding the thousand rays within it, or it is a light with a mole on it that wards off the evil eye. A letter card is the portrait of wisdom. A rough sketch from the realm of ideas, a dark light ushering into a black cloud pregnant with knowledge speaking through dumb stationery, a travelling stretcher on the sheet, and yet soaring upwards. The making of manuscripts. All books in Mughal India were manuscripts, that is, they were handwritten. The center of manuscript production was the imperial Kitab Khana. Although Kitab Khana can be translated as library, it was a scriptorium, that is a place where the emperor's collection of manuscripts was kept and new manuscripts were produced. The creation of a manuscript involved a number of people performing a variety of tasks. Paper makers were needed to prepare the folies of the manuscript, scribes or calligraphers to copy the text, gilders to illuminate the pages, painters to illustrate scenes from the text, bookbinders to gather the individual folios and set them within ornamental covers. The finished manuscript was seen as a precious object, a work of intellectual wealth and beauty. It exemplified the power of its patron, the Mughal emperor, to bring such beauty into being. At the same time, some of the people involved in the actual production of the manuscript also got recognition in the form of titles and awards. Of these, calligraphers and painters held a high social standing, while others, such as paper makers or bookbinders, have remained anonymous artisans. Calligraphy, the art of handwriting, was considered a skill of great importance. It was practiced using different styles. Akbar's favorite was the Nastaliq, a fluid style with long horizontal strokes. It is written using a piece of trimmed reed with a tip of 5 to 10 called column, dipped in carbon ink, siahi. The nib of the column is usually split in the middle to facilitate the absorption of ink. Take a look at figure 9.3, a folio in Nastaliq, the work of Muhammad Hussain of Kashmir, 1575 to 1605. One of the finest calligraphers at Akbar's court, who was honored with the title Zarin Kalam, golden pen, in recognition of the perfectly proportioned curvature of his letters. The calligrapher has signed his name on the lower section of the page, taking up almost one-fourth of its space. Discuss. In what ways do you think the production of books today is similar to or different from the ways in which Mughal chronicles were produced? The painted image. As we read in the previous section, painters too were involved in the production of Mughal manuscripts. Chronicles narrating the events of a Mughal emperor's reign contained alongside with alongside the written text images that described an event in visual form. When scene or themes in a book were to be given visual expression, the scribe left blank spaces on nearby pages. Paintings executed separately by artists were inserted to accompany what was described in words. These paintings were miniatures and could therefore be passed around for viewing and mounting on the pages of manuscripts. Paintings served not only to enhance the beauty of a book but were believed to possess special powers of communicating ideas about the kingdom and the power of kings in ways that the written medium could not. The historian Abul Fazl described painting as a magical art. In this view, it had the power to make inanimate objects look as if they possessed life. The production of paintings portraying the emperor, his court, and the people who were part of it was a source of constant tension between rulers and representatives of the Muslim orthodoxy, the ulama. The latter did not to evoke the Islamic prohibition of the portrayal of human beings enshrined in the Quran as well as the Hadith, which described an incident from the life of the Prophet Muhammad. Here, the Prophet is cited as having forbidden the depiction of living beings in a naturalistic manner, as it would suggest that the artist was seeking to appropriate the power of creation. This was a function that was believed to belong exclusively to God. Take a look at figure 9.4, a Mughal Kitab Khana. Identify the different tasks involved in the production of the Mughal manuscript depicting in this miniature. Source 1. In praise of Taswir, Abul Fazl held the art of painting in high esteem. Drawing the likeness of anything is called Taswir. His Majesty from his earliest youth has shown a great predilection for this art and gives it every encouragement, as he looks upon it as a means both of study and amusement. A very large number of painters have been set to work. Each week, several supervisors and clerks of the imperial workshop submit before the emperor the work done by each artist, and His Majesty gives a reward and increases the monthly salaries of the artist according to the excellence displayed. Most excellent painters are now to be found, and masterpieces worthy of a Bizhat may be placed at the side of the wonderful works of the European painters who have attained worldwide fame. The minuteness in detail, the general finish, and the boldness of execution now observed in pictures are incomparable. Even inanimate objects look as if they have life. More than 100 painters have become famous masters of the art. This is especially true of the Hindu artists. Their pictures surpass our conception of things. Few indeed in the whole world are found equal to them. Why did Abul Fazl consider the art of painting important? How did he seek to legitimize this art? Discuss. Compare the painter's representation figure 9.4 of literature and artistic production with that of Abul Fazl source 1. Yet interpretations of the shades changed with time. The body of Islamic tradition was interpreted in different ways by various social groups. Frequently, each group put forward an understanding of tradition that would best suit their political needs. Muslim rulers in many Asian regions during centuries of empire building regularly commissioned artists to paint their portraits and scenes of life in their kingdoms. The Safavid kings of Iran, for example, patronized the finest artists who were trained in workshops set up at court. The names of painters such as that of Bishjat contributed to spreading the cultural fame of the Safavid court far and wide. Artists from Iran also made their way to Mughal India. Some were brought to the Mughal court, as in the case of Mir Sayyid Ali and Abd Samad, who were made to accompany Emperor Humayun to Delhi. Others migrated in search of opportunities to win patronage and prestige. A conflict between the emperor and the spokesman of orthodox Muslim opinion on the question of visible representation of living beings was a source of tension at the Mughal court. Akbar's court historian Abul Fazl cites the emperor as saying, "There are many that hate painting, but such men I dislike. It appears to me that an artist has a unique way of recognizing God when he must come to feel that he cannot bestow life on his work." The Akbar Nama and the Badshah Nama. Among the important illustrated Mughal chronicles, the Akbar Nama and Badshah Nama, the chronicle of a king, are the most well known. Each manuscript contained an average of 150 full or double page paintings of battles, sieges, hunts, building constructions, court scenes, etc. The author of the Akbar Nama, Abul Fazl, grew up in the Mughal capital of Agra. He was widely read in Arabic, Persian, Greek philosophy and Sufism. Moreover, he was a forceful debater and independent thinker who consistently opposed the views of the conservative ulama. These qualities impressed Akbar, who found Abul Fazl ideally suited as an advisor and a spokesperson for his policies. One major objective of the emperor was to free the state from the control of religious orthodoxy. In his role as court historian, Abul Fazl both shaped and articulated the ideas associated with the region of Akbar. Beginning in 1589, Abul Fazl worked on the Akbar Nama for 38 years. Repeatedly revised the draft, the chronicle is based on a range of sources including actual records of events, waqi, official documents and oral testimonies of knowledgeable persons. The Akbar Nama is divided into 3 books, of which the first 2 are chronicles. The third book is the Ain-i-Akbari. The first volume contains the history of mankind from Adam to one celestial cycle of Akbar's life, 30 years. The second volume closes in the 46th regnal year 1601 of Akbar. The very next year, Abul Fazl fell victim to a conspiracy hatched by Prince Salim and was murdered by his accomplice Bir Singh Bundela. A diachronic account traces developments over time, whereas a synchronic account depicts one or several situations at one particular moment or a point of time. The Akbar Nama was written to provide a detailed description of Akbar's region in the traditional diachronic scene of recording politically significant events across time, as well as in the more novel sense of giving a synchronic picture of all aspects of Akbar's empire, geographic, social, administrative and cultural, without reference to chronology. In the Ain-i-Akbari, the Mughal Empire is presented as having a diverse population consisting of Hindus, Jainas, Buddhists and Muslims and a composite culture. Abul Fazl wrote in a language that was ornate and which attached importance to diction and rhythm. As texts were often read aloud, this Indo-Persian style was patronized at court, and there were a large number of writers who wanted to write like Abul Fazl. A pupil of Abul Fazl, Abdul Hamid Lahori is known as the author of the Badshah Nama. Emperor Shah Jahan, hearing of his talents, commissioned him to write him history of his region modeled on the Akbar Nama. The Badshah Nama is this official history in 3 volumes, daftars of 10 lunar years each. Lahori wrote the first and second drafters comprising the first 2 decades of the emperor rule 1627 to 47. These volumes were later revised by Shahidullah Khan, Shah Jahan's Wazir. Infirmities of old age prevented Lahori from proceeding with the third decade, which was then chronicled by the historian Waris. Travels of the Badshah Nama. Gifting of precious manuscripts was an established diplomatic custom under the Mughals. In emulation of this, the Nawab of Awadh gifted the illustrated Badshah Nama to King George III in 1799. Since then, it has been preserved in the English royal collections. Now at Windsor Castle in 1994, conservation work required the bound manuscript to be taken apart. This made it possible to exhibit the paintings, and in 1997 for the first time the Badshah Nama paintings were shown in exhibition in New Delhi, London and Washington. The transmission of notions of luminosity. The origins of Suhrawardi's philosophy went back to Plato's Republic, where God is represented by the symbol of the sun. Suhrawardi's writings were universally read in the Islamic world. They were studied by Sheikh Mubarak, who transmitted their ideas to his sons, Faizi and Abul Fazl, who were trained under him. During the colonial period, British administrators began to study Indian history and to create an archive of knowledge about the subcontinent to help them better understand the people and the cultures of the empire they sought to rule. The Asiatic Society of Bengal, founded by Sir William Jones in 1784, undertook the editing, printing and translation of many Indian manuscripts. Edited versions of the Akbarnama and Badshah Nama were first published by the Asiatic Society in the 19th century. In the early 20th century, the Akbarnama was translated into English by Henry Beveridge after years of hard labor. Only excerpts of the Badshah Nama have been translated into English to date. The text in its entirety still awaits translation. Discuss. Find out whether there was a tradition of illustrating manuscripts in your town or village. Who prepared these manuscripts? What were the subjects that they dealt with? How were these manuscripts preserved? The Ideal Kingdom, a divine light. Court chronicles drew upon many sources to show that the power of the Mughal kings came directly from God. One of the legends they narrated was that of the Mongol queen Alanqua, who was impregnated by a ray of sunshine while resting in her tent. The offspring she bore carried this divine light and passed it on from generation to generation. Abul Fazl placed Mughal kingship as the highest station in the hierarchy of objects receiving light emanating from God. Farai Izzati. Here he was inspired by a famous Iranian Sufi, Shihabuddin Suhrawardi, 1191, who first developed this idea. According to this idea, there was a hierarchy in which the divine light was transmitted to the king, who then became the source of spiritual guidance for his subjects. Paintings that accompanied the narrative of the chronicles transmitted these ideas in a way that left a lasting impression on the minds of viewers. Mughal artists from the 17th century onwards began to portray emperors wearing the halo, which they saw on European paintings of Christ and the Virgin Mary to symbolize the light of God. Take a look at figure 9.5. This painting by Abul Hasan shows Jahangir dressed in represented cloths and jewels, holding up a portrait of his father Akbar. Akbar is dressed in white, associated in Sufi tradition with the enlightened soul. He professes a globe, symbolic of dynastic authority. In the Mughal Empire, there was no law laying down which of the empire's son would succeed to the throne. This meant that every dynastic change was accompanied and decided by a fratricidal war. Towards the end of Akbar's reign, Prince Salim revolted against his father, seized power, and assumed the title of Jahangir. How does this painting describe the relationship between father and son? Why do you think Mughal artists frequently portrayed emperors against dark or dull backgrounds? What are the sources of lights in these paintings? A unifying force. A unifying force. Mughal chronicles present the empire as comprising many different ethnic and religious communities: Hindus, Jainas, Zoroastrians, and Muslims. As the source of all peace and stability, the emperor stood above all religious and ethnic groups, meditated among them, and ensured that justice and peace prevailed. Abul Fazl describes the idea of Shul-i-Kul, absolute peace, as the cornerstone of enlightened rule. In Shul-i-Kul, all religions and schools of thought had freedom of expression, but on condition that they did not undermine the authority of the state or fight among themselves. The idea of Shul-i-Kul was implemented through state policies. The nobility under the Mughals was a composite one, compromising Turanis, Afghans, Rajputs, Deccanis, all of whom were given positions and awards purely on the basis of their service and loyalty to the king. Further, Akbar abolished the tax on pilgrimage in 1563 and jizya in 1564. As the two were based on religious discrimination, instructions were sent to officers of the empire to follow the precept of Shul-i-Kul in administration. All Mughal emperors gave grants to support the building and maintenance of places of worship. Even when temples were destroyed during war, grants were later issued for their repair, as we know from the regions of Shah Jahan and Aurangzeb. However, during the reign of the latter, the jizya was reimposed on non-Muslim subjects. Just sovereignty as social contract. Abul Fazl defined sovereignty as a social contract. The emperor protects the four essences of his subjects, namely life, Jan, property, Mal, honor, Namus, and faith, Din, and in return demands obedience and a share of resources. Only just sovereigns were thought to be able to honor the contract with power and divine guidance. Take a look at figure 9.6. Jahangir presenting Prince Khurram with a turban jewel seen from the Badshah Nama painted by the artist Payag, 1640. Take a look at figure 9.7. Jahangir shooting the figure of poverty painting by the artist Abul Hasan. The artist has enveloped the target in a dark cloud to suggest that this is not a real person but a human form used to symbolize an abstract quality. Such a mode of personification in art and literature is termed allegory. The chain of justice is shown descending from heaven. This is how Jahangir described the chain of justice in his memoirs. After my ascension, the first order that I gave was for the fastening up of the chain of justice. So that if those engaged in the administration of justice should delay or practice hypocrisy in the matter of those seeking justice, the oppressed might come to this chain and shake it so that its noise might attract attention. The chain was made of pure gold, 30 gas in length and containing 60 bells. Identify and interpret the symbols in the painting. Summarize the message of this painting. Discuss why was justice regarded as such an important virtue of monarchy in the Mughal Empire. A number of symbols were created for visual representation of the idea of justice, which came to stand for the highest virtue of Mughal monarchy. One of the favorite symbols used by artists was the motif of the lion and the lamb or goat peacefully nestling next to each other. This was meant to signify a realm where both the strong and the weak could exist in harmony. Quote scenes from the illustrated Badshah Nama place such motifs in a niche directly below the emperor's throne. Take a look at figure 9.6. Take a look at figure 9.8, the Buland Darwaza Fatehpur Sikri. Capitals and courts. Capital cities. The heart of the Mughal Empire was its capital city, where the court assembled. The capital cities of the Mughals frequently shifted during the 16th and 17th centuries. Babur took over the Lodi capital of Agra. So during the 4 years of his reign, the court was frequently on the move. During the 1560s, Akbar had the fort of Agra constructed with red sandstone quarried from the adjoining regions. In the 1570s, he decided to build a new capital, Fatehpur Sikri. One of the reasons prompting this may have been that Sikri was located on the direct road to Ajmer, where the Dargah of Shaykh Muinuddin Chishti had become an important pilgrimage center. The Mughal emperors entered into a close relationship with Sufis of the Chishti Silsila. Akbar commissioned the construction of a white marble tomb for Shaykh Salim Chishti next to the majestic Friday Mosque at Sikri. The enormous arched gateway Buland Darwaza was meant to remind visitors of the Mughal victory in Gujarat. In 1585, the capital was transferred to Lahore to bring the northwest under greater control, and Akbar closely watched the frontier for 13 years. Shah Jahan pursued sound fiscal policies and accumulated enough money to indulge his passion for building activity in monarchical cultures, as you have seen in the case of earlier rulers, was the most visible and tangible sign of dynastic power, wealth and prestige. In the case of Muslim rulers, it was also considered an act of pity. In 1648, the court, army and the household moved from Agra to the newly completed imperial capital Shahjahanabad. It was a new addition to the old residential city of Delhi, with the Red Fort, the Jama Masjid, a tree-lined esplanade with bazaars, Chandni Chowk and spacious homes for the nobility. Shah Jahan's new city was appropriate to a more formal vision of a great monarchy. Axis mundi is a Latin phrase for a pillar or pole that is visualized as the support of the earth. Corniche was a form of ceremonial salutation in which the courtier placed the palm of his right hand against his forehead and bent his head. It suggests that the subject placed his head, the seat of the senses and the mind, into the hand of humility, presenting it to the royal assembly. The Mughal court. The physical arrangement of the court focused on the sovereignty, mirrored his status as the heart of society. Its centerpiece was therefore the throne, the takht, which gave physical form to the function of the sovereign as axis mundi. The canopy, a symbol of kingship in India for a millennium, was believed to separate the radiance of the sun from that of the sovereign. Chronicles lay down with great prescience the ruler's defining status amongst the Mughal elites in court. Status was determined by spatial proximity to the king. The place accorded to a courtier by the ruler was a sign of his importance in the eyes of the emperor. Once the emperor sat on the throne, no one was permitted to move from his position or to leave without permission. Social control in court society was exercised through carefully defining in full detail the form of address, courtesies, and speech which were acceptable in court. Source 2 Darbar I Akbari. Abul Fazl gives a vivid account of Akbar's Darbar. Whenever His Majesty Akbar holds court Darbar, a large drum is beaten, the sounds of which are accompanied by divine praise. In this manner, people of all classes receive notice. His Majesty's son and grandchildren, the grandees of the court, and all other men who have admittance attend to make the corniche and remain standing in their proper places. Learned men of renown and skillful mechanics pay their respects, and the officials of justice present their reports. His Majesty, with his usual insights, gives orders and settles everything in a satisfactory manner. During the whole time, skillful gladiators and wrestlers from all countries hold themselves in readiness, and singers, male and female, are in waiting. Clever jugglers and funny tumblers also are anxious to exhibit their dexterity and agility. The slightest infringement of etiquette was noticed and punished on the spot. The forms of salutation to the ruler indicated the Persian status in the hereditary. Deeper prostration represented higher status. The highest form of submission was sajda or complete prostration. Under Shah Jahan, these rituals were replaced with chahar, taslim, and jaminbos, kissing the ground. The protocols governing diplomatic envoys at the Mughal court were equally applicable. An ambassador presented to the Mughal emperor was expected to offer an acceptable form of greeting, either by bowing deeply or kissing the ground, or else to follow the Persian custom of clasping one's hand in front of the chest. Thomas Roy, the English envoy of James I, simply bowed before Jahangir according to European custom, and further shocked the court by demanding a chair. The emperor began his day at sunrise with personal religious devotions or prayers, and then appeared on a small balcony, the Jaroka facing the east. Below, a crowd of people, soldiers, merchants, craftspersons, peasants, women with sick children, waited for a view darshan of the emperor. Jaroka darshan was introduced by Akbar with the objective of broadening the acceptance of the imperial authority as part of popular faith. Chahar Taslim is a mode of salutation which begins with placing the back of the right hand at the ground and raising it gently till the person stands erect. When he puts the palm of his hand upon the crown of his head, it is done for Chahar times. Taslim literally means submission. Shab I Bharat is the full moon night on the 14th Shaban, the 8th month of the Hijri calendar, and is celebrated with prayers and fireworks in the subcontinent. It is the night when the destinies of the Muslims for the coming year are said to be determined and signs forgiven. The Jewel Throne. This is how Shah Jahan's Jewel Throne, Takht-i-Murassam, in the hall of public audience in the Agra Palace, is described in the Badshah Nama. This gorgeous structure has a canopy supported by 12-sided pillars and measured 5 cubits in height from the flight of steps to the overhanging dome. On His Majesty's coronation, he had commanded that 86 lakh worth of gems and precious stones and 1 lakh tolls of gold worth another 14 lakh should be used in decorating it. The throne was completed in the course of 7 years, and among the precious stones used upon it was a ruby worth 1 lakh of rupees that Shah Abbas Safavi had sent to the late Emperor Jahangir. And on this ruby were inscribed the names of the great Emperor Taimur Sahib, Quiran, Mirza Shahrukh, Mirza Ulugh Beg and Shah Abbas, as well as the names of the emperors Akbar, Jahangir and that of His Majesty himself. Take a look at figure 9.9. Shah Jahan honoring Prince Aurangzeb at Agra before his wedding, painting by Payak in the Badshah Nama. Identify the Emperor Aurangzeb in shown dressed in a yellow jama, upper garment and green jacket with little blossom. How is he placed and what does his gesture to his father suggest? How are the Khatris shown? Can you locate figures with the big turbans to the left? These are depictions of scholars. Take a look at figure 9.10. Prince Khurram Begum weighted in precious metals in a ceremony called Jashan-i-Wands or Tula, done from Jahangir's memoirs. After spending an hour at the Jharoka, the emperor walked to the public hall of audience, Diwan Ayam, to conduct the primary business of his government. State officials presented reports and made requests. 2 hours later, the emperor was in the Diwan Ikas to hold private audience and discuss confidential matters. High ministers of state placed their petitions before him and tax officials presented their accounts. Occasionally, the emperor viewed the works of highly reputed artists or building plans of architects Maimar. On special occasions such as the anniversary of accession to the throne, ID Saab I Bharat and Holi, the court was full of life. Perfumed candles set in rich holders and palace walls festooned with colorful hangings made a tremendous impression on visitors. The Mughal king celebrated three major Darashuko weddings are celebrated lavishly in the imperial household in 1633 and wedding of Dara Shikoh and Nadira, the daughter of Prince Parvez, was arranged by Princess Jahanara and Sati Annisa Khanum, the chief maid of the late Empress Mumtaz Mahal. An exhibition of the wedding gifts was arranged in the Diwan Ayam. In the afternoon, the emperor and the ladies of the harem paid a visit to it, and in the evening nobles were allowed access. The bride's mother similarly arranged her presence in the same hall and Shah Jahan went to see them. The henna bandi application of henna dye ceremony was performed in the Diwan Ikas. Betel leaf pan, cardamom and dry fruit were distributed among the attendants of the court. The total cost of the wedding was Rs 32 lakh, of which Rs 6 lakh was contributed by the imperial treasury, 16 lakh by Jahanara, including the amount alleged set aside by Mumtaz Mahal and the rest by the bride's mother. These paintings from the Badshah Nama depict some of the activities associated with the occasion. Take a look at figure 9.11a. Take a look at figure 9.11b and 11c. Describe what you see in the pictures. Festivals a year, the solar and lunar birthdays of the monarchs and Nowruz, the Iranian New Year on the vernal equinox. On his birthdays, the monarch was weighted against various commodities which were then distributed in charity. Take a look at figure 9.12, a Mughal turban box. Titles and gifts. Grand titles were adopted by the Mughal emperors at the time of coronation of or after a victory over an enemy. High sounding and rhythmic, they created an atmosphere of awe in the audience when announced by ushers Naqib. Away in the audience when announced by ushers Naqib, Mughal coins carried the full title of the reigning emperor with regal protocol. The granting of titles to men of merit was an important aspect of Mughal polity. Immense ascent in the court heraldry could be traced through the titles he held. The title Asaf Khan for one of the highest ministers originated with Asaph, the legendary minister of the prophet king Solomon. The title Mirza Raja was accorded by Aurangzeb to his two highest ranking nobles, Jai Singh and Jaswant Singh. Titles could be earned or paid for. Mir Khan offered Rs 1 lakh to Aurangzeb for the letter Alif, that is A to be added to his name to make it Amir Khan. Other awards included the Robe of Honor, Kilat, a garment once worn by the emperor and imbued with his benediction. One gift, the Sarpa, head to foot, consisted of a tunic, a turban, and a sash. Patka jeweled ornaments were often given as gifts by the emperor. The lotus blossom set with jewels, Padma Murasa, was given only in exceptional circumstances. A courtier never approached the emperor empty-handed. He offered either a small sum of money, nazar, or a large amount of peshkash. In diplomatic relations, gifts were regarded as a sign of honor and respect. Ambassadors performed the important functions of negotiating treaties and relationships between competing political powers. In such a context, gifts had an important symbolic role. Thomas Roy was disappointed when a ring he had presented to Asaf Khan was returned to him for the reason that it was worth merely 400 rupees. Discuss. Are some of the rituals and practices associated with the Mughals followed by present day political leaders? Take a look at figure 9.13, part of the inner apartments in Fatehpur Sikri. The imperial household. The term harem is frequently used to refer to the domestic world of the Mughals. It originates in the Persian word harem, meaning a sacred place. The Mughal household consisted of the emperor's wives and concubines, his near and distant relatives, mothers, step and foster mothers, sisters, daughters-in-law, aunts, children, etc., and female servants and slaves. Polygamy was practiced widely in the Indian subcontinent, especially among the ruling groups. Both for the Rajput clans as well as the Mughals, marriage was a way of cementing political relationships and forging alliances. The gift of territory was often accompanied by the gift of a doctor in marriage. This ensured a continuing hierarchical relationship between ruling groups. It was through the link of marriage and the relationship that developed as a result that the Mughals were able to form a vast kinship network that linked them to important groups and helped to hold a vast empire together. In the Mughal household, a distinction was maintained between wives who came from royal families, begums, and other wives, agas, who were not of noble birth. The begums married after receiving huge amounts of cash and valuables as dower, mahar, naturally received a higher status and greater attention from their husbands than did agas. The concubines, agacha or the lesser agha, occupied the lowest position in the hierarchy of females intimately related to royalty. They all received monthly allowances in cash, supplemented with gifts according to their status. The lineage based family structure was not entirely static. The Agha and the Agacha could rise to the position of a Begum depending on the husband's will, and provided that he did not already have four wives. Love and motherhood played important roles in elevating such women to the status of legally wedded wives. Apart from wives, numerous male and female slaves populated the Mughal household. The tasks they performed varied from the most mundane to those requiring skill, tact, and intelligence. Slave Anches Kwajisara moved between the external and internal life of the household as guards, servants, and also as agents for women dabbling in commerce. After Nur Jahan, Mughal queens and princes began to control significant financial resources. Shah Jahan's daughters Jahanara and Roshanara enjoyed an annual income often equal to that of high imperial Mansabdars. Jahanara, in addition, received revenues from the port city of Surat, which was a lucrative center of overseas trade. Control over resources enabled important women of the Mughal household to commission buildings and gardens. Jahanara participated in many architecture projects of Shah Jahan's new capital, Shah Jahanabad, Delhi. Among these was an imposing double-storied caravanserai with a courtyard and garden. The bazaar of Chandni Chowk, the throbbing center of Shah Jahanabad, was designed by Jahanara. An interesting book giving us a glimpse into the domestic world of the Mughals in the Humayun Nama, written by Gulbadan Begum. Gulbadan was the daughter of Babur, Humayun's sister and Akbar's aunt. Gulbadan could write fluently in Turkish and Persian. When Akbar commissioned Abul Fazl to write a history of his reign, he requested his aunt to record her memoirs of earlier times under Babur and Humayun for Abul Fazl to draw upon. What Gulbadan wrote was no elegy of the Mughal emperors. Rather, she describes in great detail the conflicts and tensions among the princes and kings and the important narrating role elderly women of the family played in resolving some of these conflicts. Take a look at figure 9.14, birth of Prince Salim at Fatehpur Sikri, painted by Ramdas Akbarnama. Describe the activities that the artist has depicted in each of the section of the painting on the basics of the tasks being performed by different people. Identify the members of the imperial establishment that make up the scene. The imperial officials, recruitment and rank. Mughal chronicles, especially the Akbarnama, have bequeathed a vision of empire in which agency rests almost solely with the emperor, while the rest of the kingdom has been portrayed as following his orders. Yet, if we look more closely at the rich information these histories provide about the apparatus of the Mughal state, we may be able to understand the ways in which the imperial organization was dependent on several different institutions to be able to function effectively. One important pillar of the Mughal state was its corps of officers, also referred to by historians collectively as the nobility. The nobility was recruited from diverse ethnic and religious groups. This ensured that no faction was large enough to challenge the authority of the state. The officer corps of the Mughals was described as a bouquet of flowers, guldasta held together by loyalty to the emperor. In Akbar's imperial service, Turani and Irani nobles were present from the earliest phase of carving out a political dominance. Many had accompanied Humayun, others migrated later to the Mughal court. The Mughal nobility. This is how Chandrabhan Barahman described the Mughal nobility in his book Char Chaman, Four Gardens, written during the reign of Shah Jahan. People from many races, Arabs, Irans, Turks, Tajiks, Kurds, Tatars, Russians, Abyssinians, and so on, and from many countries, Turkey, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Arabia, Iran, Khorasan, Turan. In fact, different groups and classes of people from all societies. Household refuse in the imperial court as well as different groups from India, men with knowledge and skills as well as warriors. For example, Bukharis and Bukharis, Saidas of genius lineage, Shaikadas with noble ancestry, Afghan tribes such as the Lodis, Rohillas, Yusufjai, and castes of Rajputs who were to be addressed as Rana, Raja, Rao, and Ryan. That is Rathor, Sisodiya, Kachwaha, Hada, Gaur, Chahan, Panwar, Bhaduriya, Solanki, Bundela, Shekwat, and all the other Indian tribes such as Gakkar, Kotar, Baluchi, and others who wildly this ward, the Mansabs from 100 to 7,000 Jat, likewise landowners from the steppes and mountains from the regions of Karnataka, Bengal, Assam, Udaipur, Srinagar, Kuman, Tibet and Keshwar, and so on. All tribes and groups of them have been privileged to kiss the threshold of the imperial court, that is, attend the court or find employment. Two ruling groups of Indian origin entered the imperial service from 1560 onwards, the Rajputs and the Indian Muslims. Sheikh Jadas, the first to join, was a Rajput chief, Raj Barmal Kachwaha of Amber, to whose daughter Akbar got married. Members of Hindu castes inclined towards education and accountancy were also promoted, a famous example being Akbar's finance minister, Raja Tudharmal, who belonged to the Khatri caste. Iranians gained high official offices under Jahangir, whose politically influential Queen Nur Jahan, 1645, was an Iranian. Aurangzeb appointed Rajputs to high positions, and under him the Marthas accounted for a sizable number within the body of officers. All holders of government offices held ranks mansabs, compromising two numeral designations Jat, which was an indicator of position in the imperial heraldry, and the salary of the official Mansabdar, and Sawar, which indicated the number of horsemen he was required to maintain in service. In the 17th century, Mansabdars of 1000 Jat or above ranked as nobles, Umara, which is the plural of Amir. The nobles participated in military campaigns with their armies and also served as officers of the empire in the provinces. Each military commander recruited, equipped, and trained the main striking arm of the Mughal army, the cavalry. The troopers maintained superior horses branded on the flank by the imperial mark Dhag. The emperor personally reviewed changes in rank, titles, and official postings for all except the lowest ranked officers. Akbar, who designed the Mansab system, also established a spiritual relationship with a select band of his nobility by treating them as his disciples, murid. For members of the nobility, imperial service was a way of acquiring power, wealth, and the highest possible reputation. A person wishing to join the service petitioned through a noble who presented a tajviz to the emperor, or if the applicant was found suitable, a mansab was granted to him. The Mir Bakshi, paymaster general, stood in open court on the right of the emperor and presented all candidates for appointment or promotion, while his office prepared orders bearing his seal and signature as well as those of the emperor. There were two other important ministers at the center, the Diwani Allah, finance minister, and Sadras Sudhar, minister of grants, or Majid Aimash, and in charge of appointing local judges or quadris. The three ministers occasionally came together as an advisory body, but were independent of each other. Akbar, with these and other advisors, shaped the administrative, fiscal, and monetary institutions of the empire. Source 3. Nobles at court. The Jesuit priest Father Antonio Monserrate, resident at the court of Akbar, noticed, in order to prevent the great nobles becoming insolent through the unchallenged enjoyment of power. The king summons them to court and gives them imperious commands as though they were his slaves. The obedience to these commands ill suits their exalted rank and dignity. What does Father Montserrat's observation suggest about the relationship between the Mughal emperor and his officials? Tajweez was a petition presented by a nobleman to the emperor recommending that an applicant be recruited as a Mansabdar. Nobles stationed at the court Tainat I Raghab were a reserve force to be deputed to a province or military campaign. They were duty bound to appear twice daily, morning and evening, to express submissions to the emperor in the public audience hall. They shared the responsibility for guarding the emperor and his household around the clock. Information and empire. The keeping of exact and detailed records was a major concern of the Mughal administration. Dimir Bakshi supervised the crops of court writers, Wakia Navis, who recorded all applications and documents presented to the court, and all imperial orders farman. In addition, agents, Vakil of nobles and regional rulers recorded the entire proceedings of the court under the heading News from the Exalted Court. Akbar I Darbar I Maula with the date and time of the court sessions Pahar. The Akbarat contained all kinds of information such as attendance at the court, grant of officials and titles, diplomatic missions, presents received, or the enquiries made by the emperor about the health of an officer. This information is valuable for writing the history of the public and private lives of kings and nobles. News reports and important official documents travelled across the length and breadth of the regions under Mughal rule by imperial post, round the clock relays of foot runners. Qasid or Patmar carried papers rolled up in bamboo containers. The emperor received reports from even distant provincial capitals within a few days. Agents of nobles posted outside the capital and Rajput princes and tributary rulers all assiduously copied these announcements and sent their contents by messenger back to their ministers. The emperor was connected by a surprisingly rapid information loop for public news. Beyond the center, provincial administration, the division of functions established at the center was replicated in the provinces. Subhas, where the ministers had their corresponding subordinates, Diwan, Bakshi, and Sadr. The head of the provincial administration was the governor, Subhadar, who reported directly to the emperor. The sarkars into which each Subha was divided often overlapped with the jurisdiction of Fauzdars, commandants who were deployed with contingents of heavy cavalry and musketeers in districts. The local administration was looked after at the level of the Pargana sub-district by three semi-hereditary officers: the Kwaningo, keeper of revenue records, the Chaudhuri, in charge of revenue collection, and the Qazi. Each department of administration maintained a large support staff of clerks, accountants, auditors, messengers, and other functionaries who were technically qualified officials functioning in accordance with standardized rules and procedures, and generating copious written orders and records. Persian was made the language of administration throughout, but local languages were used for village accounts. The Mughal chronicles usually portrayed the emperor and his court as controlling the entire administrative apparatus down to the village level. Yet, as you have seen chapter 8, this could hardly have been a process free of tension. The relationship between local landed magnates, the jamindars, and the representatives of the Mughal emperor was sometimes marked by conflicts over authority and shares of the resources. The Zamindars often succeed in mobilizing peasant support against the state. Discuss. Read section 2, chapter 8 once more and discuss the extent to which the emperor's presence may have been felt in villages. Beyond the frontiers, writers of chronics list many high sounding titles assumed by the Mughal emperors. These included general titles such as Shahenshah, King of Kings, or specific titles assumed by individual kings upon ascending the throne, such as Jahangir, World Sigil, or Shah Jahan, King of the World. The chronicles often drew on these titles and their meanings to reiterate the claims of the Mughal emperor to uncontested, uncontested territorial and political control. At the same, contemporary histories provide accounts of diplomatic relationship and conflicts with neighboring political powers. These reflect some tension and political rivalry arising from competing regional interests. Take a look at figure 9.15, the siege of Kandahar, the Safavids and Kandahar. The political and diplomatic relations between the Mughal kings and the neighboring countries of Iran and Turan hinged on the control of the frontier defined by the Hindu Kush mountains that separated Afghanistan from the regions of Iran and Central Asia. All conquerors who sought to make their way into the Indian subcontinent had to cross the Hindu Kush to have access to North India. A constant aim of Mughal policy was to ward off this potential danger by controlling strategic outposts, notably Kabul and Kandahar. Kandahar was the bone of contention between the Safavids and the Mughals. The fortress town had initially been in the possession of Humayun, reconquered in 1595 by Akbar. While the Safavid court retained diplomatic relations with the Mughals, it continued to stake claims to Kandahar. In 1613, Jahangir sent a diplomatic envoy to the court of Shah Abbas to plead the Mughal case for retaining Kandahar, but the mission failed. In the winter of 1622, a Persian army besieged Kandahar. The ill-prepared Mughal garrison was defeated and had to surrender the fortress and the city of the Safavids. Take a look at figure 9.16, Jahangir's dream. An inscription on this miniature records that Jahangir commissioned Abul Hasan to render in painting a dream the emperor had recently. Abul Hasan painted this scene portraying the two rulers, Jahangir and the Safavid Shah Abbas, in friendly embrace. Both kings are depicted in their traditional customs. The figure of the Shah is based upon portraits made by Bishans who accompanied the Mughal embassy to Iran in 1613. This gives a sense of authenticity to the scene, which is fictional, as the two rulers had never met. Look at the painting carefully. How is the relationship between Jahangir and Shah Abbas shown? Compare their physique and postures. What do the animals stand for? What does the map suggest? The Ottomans' pilgrimage and trade. The relationship between the Mughals and the Ottomans was marked by the consent to ensure free movement for merchants and pilgrims in the territories under Ottoman control. This was especially true for the Hijaz, that part of Ottoman Arabia where the important pilgrim centers of Mecca and Medina were located. The Mughal emperor usually combined religion and commerce by exporting valuable merchandise to Aden and Mecca, both Red Sea ports, and distributing the proceeds of the sales in charity to the keepers of shrines and religious men there. However, when Aurangzeb discovered cases of misappropriation of funds sent to Arabia, he favored their distributions in India, which he thought was as much a house of God as Mecca. Source 4. The accessible emperor. In the account of his experiences, Montserrat, who was a member of the first Jesuit mission, says it is hard to exaggerate how accessible Akbar makes himself to all who wish audience of him. For he creates an opportunity almost every day for any of the common people or of the nobles to see him and to converse with him. And he endeavors to show himself a pleasant spoken and affable rather than severe towards all who come to speak with him. It is very remarkable how great and effective effect this courtesy and affability has in attaching him to the minds of his subjects. Compare these accounts with source 2. Jesuits at the Mughal court. Europe received knowledge of India through the accounts of Jesuit missionaries, travelers, merchants, and diplomats. The Jesuits' accounts are the earliest impressions of the Mughal court ever recorded by European writers. Following the discovery of a direct sea route to India at the end of the 15th century, Portuguese merchants established a network of trading stations in coastal cities. The Portuguese king was also interested in the propagation of Christianity with the help of the missionaries of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits. The Christian missions to India during the 16th century were part of this process of trade and empire building. Akbar was curious about Christianity and dispatched an embassy to Goa to invite Jesuit priests. The first Jesuit mission reached the Mughal court at Fatehpur Sikri in 1580 and stayed for about 2 years. The Jesuits spoke to Akbar about Christianity and debated its virtues with the ulama. Two more missions were sent to the Mughal court at Lahore in 1591 and 1595. The Jesuit accounts are based on personal observation and shed light on the character and mind of the emperor. At public assemblies, the Jesuits were assigned places in close proximity to Akbar's throne. They accompanied him on his campaigns, tutored his children, and were often companions of his leisure hours. The Jesuit accounts corroborate the information given in Persian chronics about state officials and the general conditions of life in Mughal times. Discuss what were the considerations that shaped the relations of the Mughal rulers with their contemporaries. Questioning formal religion. The high respect shown by Akbar towards the members of the Jesuit mission impressed them deeply. They interpreted the emperor's open interest in the doctrines of Christianity as a sign of his acceptance of their faith. This can be understood in the light of the prevailing climate of religious intolerance in Western Europe. Montserrat remarked that the king cared little that in allowing everyone to follow his religion he was in reality violating all. Akbar's quest for religious knowledge led to interfaith debates in the Ibadat Khan at Fatehpur Sikri between learned Muslims, Hindus, Jainas, Parsis, and Christians. Akbar's religious views matured as he queried scholars of different religions and sects and gathered knowledge about their doctrines. Increasingly, he moved away from the orthodox Islamic ways of understanding religions towards a self conceived eclectic form of divine worship focused on light and the sun. We have seen that Akbar and Abul Fazl created a philosophy of light and used it to shape the image of the king and ideology of the state. In this, a divinely inspired individual has supreme sovereignty over his people and complete control over his enemies. Take a look at figure 9.17 religious debates in the court. Padre Rudolf Aquaviva was the leader of the first Jesuit mission. His name is written on the top of the painting. Home in the Haram. This is an excerpt from Abdul Qadir Badauni's Muntakab Uttawark, a theologian and a courtier. Badauni was critical of his employer's policies and did not wish to make the contents of his book public. From early youth, in compliment to his wives, the daughter of Rajas of Hindu, His Majesty had been performing home in the harem, which is a ceremony derived from fire worship, Atishparasti, but on the new year of the 25th regional year 1578, he prostrated publicly before the sun and the fire. In the evening, the whole court had to rise up respectfully when the lamps and candles were lighted. Take a look at figure 9.17. Religious debates in the court. Padre Rudolph Acquaviva was the leader of the first Jesuit mission. His name is written on the top of the painting. Take a look at figure 9.18. Blue tiles from a shrine in Multan brought by migrant artisans from Iran. These ideas were in harmony with the perspective of the court chroniclers who give us a sense of the processes by which the Mughal rulers could effectively assimilate such as a heterogeneous populace within an imperial edifice. The name of the dynasty continued to enjoy legitimacy in the subcontinent for a century and a half. Even after its geographical extent and the political control it exercised had diminished considerably. Timeline. Some major Mughal chronicles and memoirs. 1530, manuscript of Babur's memoirs in Turkish saved from a stone becomes part of the family collection of the Timurids. 1587, Gulbadan Begum begins to write the Humayun Nama. 1589, Babur's memoirs translated into Persian as a Babur Nama. 1589 to 1602, Abul Fazl works on the Akbar Nama. 1605 to 22, Jahangir writes his memoirs, the Jahangir Nama. 1639 to 47, Lahori composes the first two drafters of the Badshah Nama. 1650, Muhammad Waris begins to chronicle the third decade of Shah Jahan's reign. 1668, Alamgir Nama, a history of the first 10 years of Aurangzeb's reign, compiled by Muhammad Kazim. Answer in 100 to 150 words. Question number 1. Describe the process of manuscript production in the Mughal court. Question number 2. In what ways would the daily routine and special festivals associated with the Mughal court have conveyed a scene of the power of the emperor? Question number 3. Assess the role played by women of the imperial household in the Mughal empire. Question number 4. What were the concerns that shaped Mughal policies and attitudes towards regions outside the subcontinent? Question number 5. Discuss the major features of Mughal provincial administration. How did the center control the provinces? Write a short essay about 2500 to 300 words on the following. 250 to 300 words on the following. Question number 6. Discuss with examples the distinctive features of Mughal chronicles. Question number 7. To what extent do you think the visual material presented in this chapter corresponds with Abul Fazl's description of the Tasveer Source 1? Question number 8. What were the distinct features of the Mughal nobility? How was their relationship with the emperor shaped? Question number 9. Identify the elements that went into the making of the Mughal idea of kingship. Take a look at figure 9.19. Many Mughal manuscripts contain drawing of birds. Question number 10. Map work. On an outline map of the world, plot the areas with which the Mughals had political and cultural relations. Project choose one. Question number 11. Find out more about any one Mughal chronicle. Prepare a report describing the author and the languages, style and content of the text. Describe at least two visuals used to illustrate the chronicle of your choice, focusing on the symbol used to indicate the power of the emperor. Question number 12. Prepare a report comparing the present system of government with the Mughal court and administration, focusing on ideals of rulership, court rituals and means of recruitment into the imperial service, highlighting the similarities and differences that you notice. Take a look at figure 9.20. A Mughal painting depicting squirrels on a tree. If you would like to know more, read. The 12th history, part 2. Themes in Indian history part 2 was completed. Thank you.